Don't ever open the blue box in my study. Not while I'm alive. That was the one strange thing my husband Warren ever asked of me in 29 years of marriage, and I gave him my word without asking why. I trusted him. That was the whole of it. A man who never raised his voice, never missed a birthday, never once made me feel small, could ask me for a single locked drawer and get it. So the blue box sat on the top shelf of his study behind a row of engineering manuals, and I stopped seeing it the way you stop seeing a clock on the wall. Then Warren died on a Tuesday morning in March, halfway through his second cup of coffee, before he could tell me what was inside it. An aneurysm, the doctor said. No warning. No slow goodbye. One moment he was reading me a headline about the weather, and the next he was gone, and I was a 56-year-old widow standing in a kitchen that had gone very quiet. If you're enjoying this story so far, do me a small favor and hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It means more than you know. Now let me tell you what was in that box. For 2 weeks after the funeral, I didn't touch it. I couldn't. Every time I passed the study door, I felt him in there, and opening that box felt like breaking the last promise I had left to keep. Our daughter Nora came and went, hollow-eyed, folding his shirts into donation bags before I was ready. Our son Ethan called from Denver every night and said all the right words in a voice that had stopped meaning them. I moved through the house like a woman underwater, and then the lawyer called. His name was Mr. Prewitt, and he had handled Warren's affairs for longer than I'd realized. I sat across from him in an office that smelled of old paper and cold coffee, and I signed my name on line after line until the pen felt heavy in my hand. I thought that was all of it. Then he reached into a folder and slid a single brass key across the desk, tied with a faded ribbon to a small wooden tag shaped like a bird. "There's one more matter, Mrs. Bennett," he said. "A property and a trust." I looked at the key and felt something cold move through my chest. "We don't own any other property, just the house." "You do now," he said gently. "Your husband purchased a lake property in northern Michigan 4 years ago, a cottage and a boathouse on Loon Lake. He asked that you not be told of it until after his passing." Mr. Prewitt folded his hands. "The deed is in your name. So is the money he placed in trust to maintain it." I turned the little bird tag over in my fingers. Loon Lake. I had not heard that name spoken aloud in over 30 years, and hearing it now, in a stranger's office, from a man reading off a page, made my eyes sting before my mind even caught up. Loon Lake was where I'd spent every summer of my childhood in a green-shuttered cottage my father built with his own hands. Loon Lake was where I'd learned to sail, to paint, to be a person before life sanded all of that down. And Loon Lake was where we'd lost everything the summer I turned 17, when my father's business collapsed and the bank took the cottage along with the rest of it. I had never told Warren how much that place had shaped me. I'd mentioned it once, maybe twice, early in our marriage, and then folded it away like an old photograph you can't look at anymore. "Why would he buy a cottage on Loon Lake?" I asked. My voice didn't sound like my own. "I couldn't tell you his reasons," Mr. Prewitt said, "but he was very particular about the arrangements. And Mrs. Bennett, I should warn you, the property has attracted attention. That whole shoreline has become valuable in the last 2 years. A development group has been buying up lakefront lots. Your husband turned down 3 offers that I'm aware of." "Offers to buy it?" "Substantial ones. He wouldn't discuss them." He hesitated, and I saw something careful come into his face. "There's also a complication. Your husband's former business partner, a man named Gerald Voss, has filed a claim against the estate. He alleges that the funds used to buy and restore the property came partly from their old firm and that he's owed a share. His attorney has already made contact." I knew the name Gerald Voss. Warren had started an engineering firm with him decades ago, back before Ethan was born, and had quietly bought Gerald out and gone independent after some falling out he never fully explained. Warren didn't hold grudges out loud, but I'd noticed the way his jaw tightened the one time Gerald's name came up at a wedding years back. Now here it was again, circling the one thing Warren had left me. I took the key. I don't know what changed in me in that office, but by the time I stood up, something had. "I'm going up there," I said. "This week." 2 days later, I drove 5 hours north through country that turned slowly from brown to pine, and I found myself sitting in my car at the end of a gravel road, staring at a mailbox with the name Bennett painted on it in Warren's neat block letters. Beyond it, a driveway curved down through birch trees toward the water, and at the bottom of that driveway stood a cottage that stopped my heart. It was my father's cottage, not a copy of it. The same green shutters, the same wide porch, the same fieldstone chimney, all of it lovingly restored and painted and made whole again, sitting exactly where it had sat when I was a girl. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. Warren had found it. He had found the cottage my family lost, tracked it down across 4 decades, and he had bought it back and rebuilt it, and he had never said a single word to me about any of it. I walked down that driveway on legs that didn't feel like mine. The key turned in the front door the way keys turn in dreams, smooth and certain, and I stepped inside, and I had to grip the doorframe to keep standing. The main room opened up with a stone fireplace on one wall and tall windows looking out over the lake. But it wasn't the water that took my breath. It was the walls. Warren had hung them with paintings, watercolors of Loon Lake at every hour, the loons on the morning mist, the light coming gold across the water at dusk, a small green cottage seen from a boat, and I knew every brushstroke because they were mine. These were the paintings I'd made as a teenager, the ones I thought had been thrown out or lost or ruined decades ago. Warren had saved them. All these years he had kept them somewhere I'd never looked, and he had framed them and hung them in the one place on earth they belonged. On a desk by the window sat a wooden chest, painted blue, exactly like the box from his study. A folded letter rested on the lid with my name on it in his handwriting. My hands shook so hard I nearly dropped it. "My dearest Claire," it began, "if you're reading this, then I've run out of time before I could do this the right way, and I'm sorry. I always thought there'd be one more summer. There were things I should have told you and couldn't, not because I didn't trust you, but because I was afraid of what telling you would cost. The cottage is yours. It always should have been. I found it 7 years ago on a work trip, and I couldn't believe it was still standing. And I made a decision that day that I would give you back the one thing the world took from you before I ever knew you. Everything you need to understand is in the blue chest and in the journals inside it. Read them in order. And Claire, whatever Gerald tells you, do not sign anything until you've read all of it. I love you more than I ever managed to say out loud. Warren." I was still holding that letter, my face wet, when I heard tires on the gravel behind me. Through the window, I watched a black car pull in beside mine and a man climb out in an expensive coat that didn't belong at a lake. He was tall and silver-haired and moved like he already owned the ground he walked on. A younger man in a gray suit got out of the passenger side carrying a leather folder. I knew, before either of them reached the door, that Gerald Voss had found me faster than I'd found the truth. I folded Warren's letter into my pocket and opened the door before he could knock, because I've learned that a threshold means something, and I wanted to be the one standing in it. "Mrs. Bennett." Gerald's smile was warm, and his eyes were not. "Claire, I'm so terribly sorry about Warren. He was a brilliant man, the best I ever worked with." "You didn't drive 5 hours to tell me that," I said. The smile flickered, then settled back into place. "No, I suppose I didn't." He glanced past me into the cottage, and I saw him take inventory of it the way a man prices a thing he intends to sell. "May we come in? This is Mr. Lang, my attorney. There's a situation with the estate I think we should discuss before it gets complicated for everyone, especially for you." I did not step aside. "The estate isn't complicated. My husband left this to me, in writing, filed and notarized." "Warren left a great many things in writing," Gerald said smoothly. "Some of them contradict others. When we started our firm, Claire, we mixed everything together, capital and credit and years of work. He walked away with the client list and the cash and left me holding the paper. I never made a fuss because we were friends. But this property was bought with money that had my name on it too, and now that it's worth what it's worth, I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He spread his hands, reasonable as a Sunday sermon. "I'm not here to take your home. I'm here to be fair. There's a development group offering more than either of us could dream of. We sell, we split it, everyone walks away whole. You go back to your life a wealthy woman. That's the kindest ending here, and you know it." The younger man opened his folder and set a document on the porch rail, turned so I could read the number at the bottom. It was a large number, larger than Warren's salary had ever been, larger than anything I'd held in my life. "I'll have my own attorney review anything you'd like to send me," I said. "By mail. Now please get off my husband's driveway." Gerald's face didn't harden the way I expected. It softened, which was worse. "Claire," he said quietly, "I've already spoken to your son." The porch tilted under me. "You've what?" "Ethan reached out to me, actually. He found my name in some of Warren's old papers." Gerald let that sit, watching it land. "He's in a hard spot financially. I think you know that. He was very glad to hear there might be a way to turn this cottage into something that could actually help his family. He and I see this the same way." He picked up the document and handed it back to his attorney, unhurried, a man who had all the time in the world. "Talk to your son, then call me." I closed the door and locked it and stood with my back against it until I heard their car pull away. Then I sat down at the desk, opened the blue chest, and took out the first of Warren's journals, because I understood now that whatever was in them was the only thing standing between me and losing this twice. There were 7 journals, dated across the last 7 years. I read the first one straight through as the light went down over the lake and the loons started calling out on the black water, and by the end of it I understood the shape of the man I'd been married to in ways I never had while he was alive. Warren had found the cottage the way he said, on a work trip 7 years back. He'd recognized it from the little I'd told him and from an old snapshot he'd once found in my mother's things. It was falling apart by then, owned by an absentee family who used it twice a year and let it rot the rest. He'd started buying it in secret, a slow and careful campaign, using money he saved by traveling coach and skipping the new car, and taking on side consulting work he told me was for retirement. Every business trip north for 4 years, he wrote, he was really here, in work boots, hanging shutters and sanding floors, and learning to do things with his hands that an engineer of his rank had no business doing himself. He hired a local man named Sam to help him, and the 2 of them rebuilt my childhood one board at a time. But the journals held more than a love story. Somewhere in the 3rd one, Warren's handwriting changed. It got smaller, more urgent, and he started writing about Gerald. The firm hadn't ended over a business disagreement. It had ended because Warren discovered that Gerald was moving client money into accounts that didn't exist, skimming from projects, forging signatures on invoices, and covering it with a second set of books. Warren found it by accident and confronted him. Gerald's answer had been a threat. If Warren went to anyone, Gerald would tie his name to all of it, drag the firm and every employee down into a fraud investigation that would ruin dozens of families who'd done nothing wrong. So Warren made a choice I'm not sure I could have made. He bought Gerald out at a loss, took the smaller share, walked away in silence, and kept every scrap of evidence in case he ever needed it. He didn't do it to protect himself. He did it to protect the draftsmen and the secretaries and the young engineers who would have lost everything if the whole thing collapsed. He carried the shame of looking guilty for 20 years so that people who never knew his name wouldn't lose their jobs, and he kept the proof. Bank records, the forged invoices, sworn statements from 2 former employees, copies of the second ledger in Gerald's own handwriting. It was all in the blue chest, in a folder Warren had labeled, in his dry way, in case Gerald ever forgets who he is. I sat there in the dark, and I laughed and cried at the same time, because Warren had known. He'd known that the moment the cottage became valuable, Gerald would come sniffing after it with his lawyers and his reasonable smile, and he had left me a weapon and a warning, and told me not to sign anything until I'd found them. My quiet husband, who I thought had never fought anyone in his life, had been 3 steps ahead of a man like Gerald Voss for 2 decades, but he hadn't planned on Ethan. I called my son that night. He answered on the 4th ring in a voice I recognized, the careful, defensive voice he used when he already knew he was doing something I wouldn't like. "Mom, hey, look, I was going to call you." "You talked to Gerald Voss before you talked to me," I said. I kept my voice even. It was the hardest thing I did that whole week. "Ethan, what's going on?" There was a long breath on the line. "We're going to lose the house, Mom. Ours. Jess and I are 3 months behind, and the clinic cut my hours, and I didn't want to tell you because you just buried Dad, and I couldn't put that on you too." His voice cracked. And then this guy Voss calls, and he's talking about numbers that would fix everything, all of it. And it's a cottage none of us even knew about a week ago. Dad hid it from us. He hid a whole property. Why should I feel loyal to a place he never even told us existed? And there it was, the exact wound Gerald had known how to press. My son wasn't greedy. He was drowning, and a stranger had thrown him a rope, and the rope happened to be tied to the one thing his father had spent 7 years and every spare dollar trying to give me. "Ethan," I said, "I need you to do one thing before you decide anything. I need you to drive up here, not for Gerald, for me. There's something you have to see with your own eyes, and after you've seen it, if you still think we should sell, I'll listen. I promise you I'll listen, but not before." He was quiet a long time. "The house, Mom. Jess is scared." "I know," I said, "and I'm not going to let you lose it, but not like this. Come see first, please." He came 2 days later. While I waited for him, I met Sam, the man who had helped Warren rebuild the cottage. He was in his 60s, weathered and slow to speak, and he came up the driveway on the second morning with a thermos of coffee and grief plain on his face. He'd worked beside Warren for 4 years and hadn't heard until a mutual contact told him. We sat on the porch, and he told me things about my husband I'd never known. How Warren would drive up on Friday nights and work until his hands bled. How he'd talked about me constantly. How he'd stand at the end of the dock some evenings just looking at the water, with an expression Sam couldn't read. "He knew about his heart, I think," Sam said carefully, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Not the specifics, but there was a stretch last year he pushed hard, worked like a man trying to finish something. Told me once he wanted it done while he still had the hands to do it. I didn't understand what he meant. I do now. I hadn't known Warren had any warning at all. The doctors called it sudden. Maybe it was to them. But sitting there with Sam, I understood that some part of my husband had felt the clock running and had answered it not with fear, but with a hammer and a paintbrush and a stubborn private love. He never told me he might be sick. Maybe he didn't fully know. But he'd built me a place to land before the ground gave out under him, and he'd done it in silence so I'd never have to watch him race. "There's something else you ought to see," Sam said. He led me down to the boathouse, the one building I hadn't gone into yet. He unlocked it and pushed the doors wide, and there in the dim light, riding in its cradle above the water, was a small wooden sailboat, restored to a gleam, its hull painted deep green with a name lettered on the stern in gold, the Wren. It was my father's boat, the same boat I'd learned to sail as a girl, the boat that had been sold off with everything else the summer we lost the cottage. Warren had found it too. He'd tracked it to a barn 3 counties over, half rotted, and he and Sam had spent a winter bringing it back to life. My father used to call me his little Wren because I was small and I never stopped moving. I had told Warren that once, early, in the dark, and he had held on to it for 30 years and given it back to me in gold letters on the stern of a boat I thought I'd never touch again. I was standing in that boathouse with my hand on the hull when I heard a car in the drive, and I came out into the light to find my son standing at the top of the slope, looking down at the cottage, at the water, at the mother he'd flown across the country to talk out of a foolish, grieving mistake, and I watched his face change. "Mom," he said, "what is this place?" I brought him inside. I sat him down in front of my old paintings, and I put Warren's first letter in his hands, and I made him read it. Then I gave him the journals, and I gave him time. He read for 2 hours without speaking. I watched my son learn who his father really was, and I watched the anger drain out of him and something heavier and truer take its place. When he got to the part about Gerald, about the fraud and the forged invoices, and the 20 years his father spent looking guilty to protect strangers, he put the journal down and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "He let that guy make him look like a thief," Ethan said, his voice thick, "for 20 years, to save people he barely knew." "Yes," I said. "And that's the guy who called me, who told me Dad screwed him over." He laughed a broken sound. "He knew I wouldn't know. He knew I was broke and Dad was dead and I wouldn't know any better." He looked up at me, and for the first time since the funeral, my son looked me straight in the eye. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I almost helped him." "You didn't know," I said. "Grief makes us easy to steer. He counted on that." I reached across and took his hand. "But we know now. Both of us." And your father left us everything we need to end this. So we're not going to lose your house, and we're not going to lose this one either. We're going to do this the way Warren would have, 3 steps ahead. Ethan wiped his face, and something in his jaw set the way Warren's used to. Okay, he said. Tell me the plan. The plan took a week to build. I called Mr. Prewitt and read him the contents of the folder over the phone, and I heard the careful lawyer's voice go very still. I had copies made of everything, the ledgers, the invoices, the sworn statements, and I sent one set to my attorney and locked another in a bank 2 towns over. Then I made 2 phone calls Gerald would never have expected. The first was to the development group buying up the shoreline, the ones Gerald was using as his prize. The second was to a woman named Dana Reyes, a former employee of the old firm, one of the 2 people whose sworn statement sat in Warren's folder, who I found still living an hour south, and who wept on the phone when I told her Warren had kept her name safe all these years. Then I called Gerald and invited him to the cottage to settle things, and I could hear him smiling through the phone. He arrived on a bright Saturday morning with his attorney Mr. Lang and a third man I didn't recognize, a smooth type in a blazer who introduced himself as a representative of the development group there, Gerald said, to make the process easy for everyone. They walked into my father's cottage like men arriving at a closing, and Gerald actually complimented the fireplace on his way to the table. I let them sit. I offered coffee. Ethan stood by the window with his arms crossed, and Gerald gave him a warm nod, the nod of a man who thinks he's got an ally in the room. Mr. Lang laid out the sale documents in the split, and Gerald folded his hands and said, I know this is an emotional time, Claire, so we've tried to make the terms as generous as we can. You'll see we've allocated a share directly to Ethan and his family, given his circumstances. Nobody wants anyone to struggle. That's thoughtful, I said. Before we discuss the split, I'd like to make sure everyone's working from the same history. You told my son that Warren cheated you when your firm ended. I'd like to clear that up for the record. Gerald's smile stayed put, but his eyes moved. Ancient history, Claire. Business is messy. No need to drag Warren's name through it now that he can't defend himself. Warren defended himself just fine, I said. I opened the folder in front of me and set the first page on the table, turned so the development man could read it. This is a copy of a ledger in your handwriting, Gerald, the second set of books you kept at the old firm. These are the invoices you forged. And this, I slid the next page across, is a sworn, notarized statement from Dana Reyes describing how you moved client funds into accounts that didn't exist. She's willing to say it again, under oath, in front of anyone who'll listen. So is Paul Ferris. The room went silent. The development man leaned forward and read, and I watched the color go out of Gerald's face by degrees, the way you watch a tide go out. Warren found all of this 20 years ago, I said. He didn't turn you in, because if he had, 40 innocent people would have lost their jobs and had their names dragged into a fraud case. So he bought you out at a loss and let the whole world think he was the one who broke up a good partnership. He carried that for 2 decades so that people like Dana Reyes could keep their houses. And you repaid him by driving up here 2 weeks after his funeral to lie to his grieving son and steal the one gift he ever managed to give me. My voice didn't shake. I made sure of that. There was never any of your money in this cottage, Gerald. Every dollar of it was Warren's, saved a little at a time. You know that better than anyone. Mr. Lang was already reaching for his own papers, murmuring something to Gerald about needing to confer with his client. The development man stood up, buttoned his blazer, and said, in the flat voice of a company protecting itself, that his group would not be pursuing any transaction connected to a disputed and potentially fraudulent claim, and that they would be terminating discussions immediately. He was in his car before Gerald finished sputtering. You wouldn't dare make any of that public, Gerald said, and the reasonable warmth was gone from him now, and what was left underneath was uglier and smaller than I'd imagined. The statute of limitations. You have no idea what you're... I've spoken with a lawyer, I said. Some of it may be too old to prosecute, some of it isn't, and the licensing board that oversees your consulting work has no statute of limitations on character, and neither does the newspaper, and neither do the clients you still have. I closed the folder. But I'm not Warren. I don't want to spend 20 years carrying this, so here's what's going to happen. You're going to withdraw your claim against the estate today, in writing. You're going to leave my family alone, and my son alone, for good. And in exchange, this folder stays in a drawer where it's been sitting for 20 years. Quiet, the way Warren would have wanted it. That's more mercy than you've earned. Take it before I change my mind." Gerald Voss looked at me for a long moment, and I saw him understand, finally, that the naive widow he'd driven north to fleece had been handed a loaded weapon by a dead man who'd loved her and knew exactly how to use it. He signed the withdrawal that afternoon in Mr. Lang's careful hand. Then he stood, and he looked around my father's cottage one last time, and he left, and I have not heard his name spoken since. When their cars were gone, Ethan came and stood beside me on the porch, and for a while neither of us said anything. The lake was flat and bright. A loon surfaced out near the middle, dipped, and vanished. "He beat him," Ethan said quietly. "Dad beat him. From the grave. That's insane." "Your father was the most patient man I ever knew," I said. "People mistook it for softness their whole lives. It was never softness. I did not let my son lose his house. That was the first thing I did once the estate cleared. The trust Warren left was more than enough to catch Ethan up and give him and Jess room to breathe, and I did it without a second thought, because it was exactly what Warren had built it for. He'd have been ashamed of me if I'd let his grandchildren worry over a mortgage while a cottage sat empty on a lake. Ethan tried to refuse. I didn't let him. That's what the money was for, not for a stranger's development. For us. I stayed on at Loon Lake through the spring and into the summer. I told the school I wasn't coming back, and I was surprised by how easy it was to say. Nora came up in June with her kids, and they swam off the same dock I swam off as a girl, and I taught my grandchildren to sail the Wren in the same shallow water where my father taught me. Some evenings I stand at the end of that dock the way Sam said Warren used to, and I understand now what my husband was looking at. He was looking at a future he wouldn't get to see. He was leaving it to me anyway. I started painting again. I hadn't held a brush in 35 years, and the first afternoon I tried, my hands felt like a stranger's, and everything I made was clumsy and wrong. But Warren had left an easel and a full set of paints in the corner of the study, waiting, next to a note I found tucked in a drawer that said only, "She's still in there. I've saved you the seat." So I sat down, and I kept sitting down, day after day, and slowly the woman who used to paint this lake came back into my hands. There's a new watercolor hanging in the main room now, next to the ones I made at 17. It's the same cottage, the same green shutters, but there are children on the dock in this one, and a small green boat on the water. And if you look closely at the porch, there's a figure standing in the doorway, watching the way he always watched. I think about trust a lot now. I trusted a man for 29 years who was keeping an enormous secret, and I could sit here and tell you that a secret like that is a betrayal, that he should have told me, that a marriage should have no locked drawers in it. Some days I even believe that. But then I walk through this cottage he rebuilt board by board, past the paintings he saved, and the boat he brought back from the dead, and I understand that the secret was never a wall between us. It was a gift he couldn't bear to give me half-finished. He didn't hide the cottage from me because he didn't trust me. He hid it because he wanted the day I finally saw it to be complete, whole, worthy of the girl I'd been before the world took this place away. He ran out of time to hand it to me himself, so he handed it to me the only way he had left, through letters and journals and a brass key shaped like a bird, and he trusted that when the wolves came, I'd be strong enough to send them running. He was right about that. He was right about almost everything. What I learned, in the end, is that trust isn't the absence of secrets. Warren kept a secret from me for 7 years, and it turned out to be the truest thing he ever did. Trust is knowing that whatever a person is carrying in silence, they're carrying it toward you and not away. I gave him a locked drawer and my word, and he gave me back my whole childhood, my father's boat, my own 2 hands. I'd make that trade again 1,000 times over. The cottage is mine now, and one day it will be Ethan's and Nora's and their children's, and the story of how it came back to us will be told on that porch for as long as the family lasts. Gerald Voss thought he was buying a piece of shoreline. He never understood that some things can't be bought or split or sold because their whole worth is in what they cost the person who gave them. My husband spent 7 years and everything he had in secret, and he never got to see my face when I walked through that green door. But I like to think he knew. I like to think that, wherever he is, He can see the children on the dock and the paint on my hands and the new watercolor on the wall, and that it looks to him the way it looks to me, like a promise kept, like a love that outlasted the man who built it. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who understands what it means to be truly loved. Leave a comment and tell me, would you have forgiven a secret like Warren's? I read everyone. Thank you for listening, and until the next story, take care of the people who carry things toward you.